The big news that came out today is not necessarily the inflation news that we've been discussing, but a legal ruling on Obamacare. We've got a decision by the Circuit Court in the District of Columbia regarding a key aspect of Obamacare. When the law was originally written, the law provided that if people bought their insurance on an exchange that was established by a state, that the federal government would supply a subsidy for poor people to offset the cost of buying that insurance. But the problem is that 3/4 of the states never set up their exchanges. That is something that the law did not account for. The law, as it was written and as it was passed, simply assumed that all the states would, in fact, set up exchanges. But it didn't require the states to set up exchanges. And, of course, the vast majority did not. As a result, the federal government set up exchanges, and the IRS has been providing subsidies to people who buy on federal exchanges, even though no such provision actually exists in the law that was passed. So it was adjudicated. And the government tried to argue, well, it doesn't matter what it's written. The intent was to provide the subsidy, and it's just a mistake, that we wrote it wrong, and nobody realized it until after we passed it, which is maybe why they should read the bills before they pass them. Remember, Nancy Pelosi said, we got to pass the bill to see what's in it. Well, we passed it, and now we see what's in it, and what's in it is not what people thought was in it. Well, you know what? It's not the intention that should count. It's what was actually passed, what was actually written. Because how do you know what the intent was? If that was the intent, why didn't they say so in the law? Because it's possible that people who voted for it read it. Maybe there's some people that read it and that's what they voted for. But why don't they, if they want to change it, change it. But the problem is they can't get the change through the House because the current House of Representatives will not pass the amendment that would be needed to make the federal subsidy apply to people who buy on the government exchanges. Of course, the Obama administration initially by executive order just said, well, we don't care what's written in the law. We don't care what Congress actually passed. We don't care what I actually signed. I am going to have the IRS do this anyway. And the court said you can't do that. You cannot usurp congressional power. You cannot enforce a bill that was not passed. And if the president wants to enforce it this way, he needs to have a rider and have that pass through Congress. He just can't bypass Congress, which is what he did. So the court, 2-1, right? There's only 3 judges that decided. So one judge said that the president was right, that he could do it. But 2 judges said no. So where does that leave it? Well, now there's an appeal. The next thing that the government could do is they can appeal en banc and ask that all of the 11 judges on that circuit render an opinion. And it's possible, given the fact that 4 of those judges were recent Obama appointees who might rubber stamp what he's doing, it's possible that this 2-1 decision could be reversed, and then there would be an appeal up to the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, I think it's pretty obvious that the court would reject the idea that you can look beyond what was actually written and try to guess at what they had intended to do. Because that's only a guess. You don't really know what the intention was because that's not what they wrote. If they intended the subsidies to apply, even if there is no state exchange, why didn't they write that? They could have written that. Now, maybe this is a contingency that they didn't count on, but hey, if they want to change it, they should have to get the votes in the current Congress to change it. And if they can't, well, tough. And, if this thing is ultimately struck down, if what the court just ruled is ultimately upheld, either by the appeals court en banc or at the Supreme Court level, that's pretty much it for Obamacare, unless they can get enough Democrats in the House to pass some kind of a rider to correct the mistake in the original bill. Because if all of the lower income people cannot get a subsidy, then they can't afford The insurance. I mean, a lot of them can't even afford it with the subsidy. But again, there's no reason to buy it because, just wait till you get sick because, that you're covered no matter what. But this really would be the nail in the coffin of Obamacare if it's not reversed. The question for me is, what if the appeals process takes a few years? I mean, can they continue it? Can the government continue to do something that has already been ruled illegal by this one court? And what if after a few years, the Supreme Court upholds this ruling and says, yes, you can't do it? What happens to all the people in those states, and there's some 34 or so states where poorer people are getting illegal subsidies? What is going to happen? Are they going to get retroactively billed for the full premium? I mean, good luck collecting that fine. But if people think that potentially they're exposed to a retroactive fee increase, maybe they'll be reluctant to pay anything, knowing that they're exposed to a higher rate. But I would think that since they've already been told they can't do it, that you'd think that they would have to stop until they win the appeal, because practically speaking, you're not going to be able to get these poor people to cough up the difference between what they actually paid and what they should have paid absent that federal subsidy. But again, this gets right to the heart of the matter. The idea that you can pass this sweeping, comprehensive legislation, having no idea what's actually written there, and just say, well, we'll pass it and see what's in it. Because you can be very surprised at what's in it, and then you can't take the attitude, well, now that we see what's in it, we don't like it, so let's just change it after the fact without voting on it. Well, how could you do that? How could you amend a law? How could you change a law just because you don't like it? You need to repeal it or replace it with something, or you need to pass some kind of addendum that says this is enacted, a change to the previous legislation. If the president can just alter any legislation he wants based on what he thinks people intended to do, then there's no limit to his power. He can go through all sorts of bills that were passed and say, I know what this bill said, but I don't think that's what they really meant. I don't think that's what they really wanted to do. I think they had a much broader purpose. I think they had a lot more in mind. And so I'm going to expand the scope of these laws well beyond what was actually passed because, I kind of think that that's really what they wanted to do all along, but they just weren't bold enough. They didn't think they could pass it if they put what they really wanted to do in there. So they passed some kind of watered down version, and I'm now going to fill it up with water because, I can do whatever I want because I'm the president. That is the attitude that he has, and that attitude needs to be stopped, and it needs to be stopped now. The Obama administration is already out with their official statement on this ruling, basically saying that what the government has been doing is illegal, that the president overstepped his authority, usurped congressional power, that the IRS has no statutory authority to give out subsidies to people who buy insurance through the federal exchanges, that the statute limits those subsidies to people who buy on the state exchanges. Now, the wording of the law is clear, right? It's clear what it says. But Obama says that the ruling changes nothing and that the subsidies will continue despite what the court says, because according to Obama, the court is wrong. So in other words, President Obama doesn't care what Congress passes. He doesn't care what the court says. It's all up to him. So apparently we have a dictatorship where the president holds all the cards. No checks and balances, right? No distribution of power, that all of the power resides with the president. And the president does whatever the president wants. That is the type of country that President Obama believes that he is presiding over. Now, I think it's interesting, too, that they keep talking about intent. What was the intent? They said, don't look at what the law actually says. Try to look beyond the written words and go back to the intent of the lawmakers. Now, I think that's very interesting because that's the so-called concept of, well, let's look at the original intent. Of course, when it comes to all sorts of laws, right, that are unconstitutional, it's the Democrats that say, no, you can't look at the intent of the lawmakers. You can't look at the intent of the framers. You can't interpret the Constitution based on the original intent. It needs to be a living, breathing document. It needs to change with the times. So it doesn't matter what the founding fathers intended when they wrote the Constitution. What matters is, what we think today, right? That's what they say. They argue that the conservatives who believe in original intent, well, they're wrong. But now they're arguing right now original intent. They're saying the court should just look beyond the mere language of the bill and look to the intent of the people who passed it. Well, if that's the case, why don't we do that with the Constitution? Because if we go for original intent, the entire Obamacare is unconstitutional. I mean, if you're going to rely or look to original intent, not only is Obamacare unconstitutional, so is Social Security, so is Medicare, so is almost everything the government is doing. All these laws passed, pursuant to the Commerce Clause, like the minimum wage that he wants to raise. If we want to look to the original intent behind the Constitution, the minimum wage is unconstitutional. But I'm going to tell you why original intent is not important here, okay? Because I don't want to look like a hypocrite, because I believe in original intent. So then why shouldn't the current court look beyond the language of the statute and look to the original intent? Because it was passed just a few years ago. The words haven't changed. See, the problem is people are trying to broaden the scope of the Constitution by reading things into, the Congress can regulate commerce. What does that mean? What does it mean, regulate commerce? And since, the court says, well, that's kind of broad, we're gonna define what that means. But if you actually go back and read, right, let's say the Elliott debates, which were written by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, right, they actually explain what they meant by that. There's all sorts of ample evidence to show what the founding fathers meant when they passed the Commerce Clause, exactly what powers they were really given, the federal government. But people want to ignore the original intent, even though it's clear, because they explained it in writing, and they want to try to broaden the meaning of what commerce is to justify all these other bills. But the current situation has nothing to do with trying to figure out what was meant. When you have a specific provision that says Congress shall provide a subsidy to anybody who purchases insurance on an exchange organized by a state, there's no interpretation. There's no ambiguity there. There's nothing that needs to be understood. It's very clear. The words are there. They were just passed a few years ago. If Congress wanted it to apply differently, they could have written it that way. They were extremely specific in their language. And when the language is very specific, if it tells you exactly what it is in no uncertain terms, why would you have to look to the intent? You don't need the intent. The intent is right there in black and white. The Constitution, right? If you want to know, what does this mean? What did the founders mean when they said that Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce? Well, the only way to know what they meant is to read what they told you they meant, because it's there. They wrote it out. But that's kind of broad. What constitutes interstate commerce? There is no ambiguity here. You cannot change the law. It doesn't matter what they intended to pass. They didn't pass it. That's not what they wrote. They wrote something different. So you can't take the doctrine of original intent and say, well, we intended to do it. It's like, let's say you're a student in class and you put down the wrong answer on the exam. You thought, yeah, but I intended to put down a different answer. Why don't you grade me on my original intent? Don't grade me on what I actually wrote down as my answer, because I intended to write something. You can't do that. You can't go back and say, look, we passed it this way, but we intended to pass it a different way, so now we're going to change it. That's not the way it was ratified. That's not the bill the House and the Senate voted on. It's not the bill that the president signed. If he wanted a different bill, they should have written it that way, and they still have time. Why don't they write a brand new bill the way they want it? Because now they can't pass it. Because now nobody wants Obamacare. So you know what? This is our out, right? And this shows you how unworkable it is. Because they have to change the law after the fact to theoretically make it work, and it still doesn't work. But the fact that President Obama can be so arrogant and say, I don't care. I don't care what the court says. The court's wrong, I'm right. How is he right? He doesn't give a damn. How is this guy even still president? Why do we even have to abide by any of these laws? Why aren't states seceding from the union? If the president can act like a dictator and do whatever he wants, then what checks and balances do we have? What is left of our republic? We made a big deal years ago about Nixon, covering up some wiretaps from a hotel where people. I mean, that is nothing. That is child's play compared to what President Obama is getting away with every day. We went to impeach Bill Clinton based on telling lies about whether he had sex with Monica Lewinsky. This is much worse. The offenses that President Obama commits are far worse, and nobody cares. And if he can get away with it, the precedent is everybody can get away with it. The presidency is getting progressively more imperial. Maybe they should have debated this a little bit more. Maybe people should have read it thoroughly before they voted on it. Maybe the idea of Nancy Pelosi, you got to pass it to see what's in it, is not the way to go. Because when you pass it and then wait to see what's in it, well, then you find out that maybe you made some mistakes. And you know what? Tough. If you don't like what's in it after you pass it, the president can't just unilaterally change it and say, well, this is what we actually meant to do. And, I don't even care what they meant. If they didn't do what they meant, then they didn't do it. I mean, if that's the case, if anybody can get out of a contract and change a contract by saying, well, it doesn't matter what we actually wrote in the contract because I really intended something different. Well, it doesn't matter. That's not the contract you signed. That's not the contract the counterparty signed. How do they know what all these individual congressmen voted for? Maybe some of the people who voted for it wouldn't have voted for it if the language were different. We don't know. And the president can't just go back and claim that, well, we intended to do this. Now, apparently there was another circuit, the Fourth Circuit, that within a few hours of this ruling came out and ruled the other way. They actually bought the government's argument that what's written in the law doesn't actually matter, that what matters is their intention, even if they intended something that the law did not provide for. Because this is not a case where it's ambiguous. It's specific. The language is clear. Normally, when you would rely on intention is if the language wasn't clear. And then you wanted to figure out, well, what does this mean? What did the lawmakers mean when they wrote this? Then you'd try to go back for some evidence of what their intention was by looking at the debates and things like that. But if the language is crystal clear, when it says there can be a subsidy to somebody who buys on a state-run exchange, well, that's clear. It's clearly limited to people who buy on a state exchange. You can't expand it and say, well, we're going to expand it to a federal exchange, even though it's not written there, because that's what they meant. Well, if that's what they meant, why didn't they write it? And if they're saying, well, it was a mistake, well, tough. You make a mistake, you got to deal with the consequences. You can't just correct it. That's not how it's supposed to work. But here is the president's White House press conference. This is Josh Earnest, who is doing the briefing on why this decision is meaningless and it's not going to change anything. Here, it's cut number 20.
The first is it's important for people all across the country to understand that this ruling does not have any practical impact on their ability to continue to receive tax credits right now. Right now, there are millions of Americans all across the country who are receiving tax credits from the federal government as a result of the Affordable Care Act that is making health care more affordable for them. And while this ruling is interesting to legal theorists, it has no practical impact on their tax credits right now.
Yeah, legal theorists. Yes, there are millions of people who are getting subsidies, but they're getting them illegally. That is the point. They're getting these subsidies illegally. But they don't care. And they're confident that the rulings or their position is going to be upheld on the Supreme Court. But I wouldn't be so confident. I mean, just because they were willing to compromise in a 5-4 decision, right, to call the penalty a tax, I don't think that they're necessarily going to get the same 5 justices to come out and say, well, we're going to change the literal statute based on an argument by the government that they actually meant something different than what's actually written in the statute. I don't think you're going to get, I think it was Justice Kennedy who was the swing vote. I don't think he's going to swing that way. So I think there's a pretty good chance that this idea that you can get a subsidy by buying on a federal exchange, I have a pretty good idea that the Supreme Court's going to say you can't. And if that's what undoes Obamacare, well, then that's what undoes it. And so much the better. Here's a little bit more from this briefing, cut number 23.
The last thing that's important, and this is, there's a lot of high-minded case law that's applied here. There's also an element of common sense that should be applied as well, which is that you don't need a fancy legal degree to understand that Congress intended for every eligible American to have access to tax credits that would lower their health care costs, regardless of whether it was state officials or federal officials who are running the marketplace. I think that is a pretty clear intent of the congressional law. This will work its way through the legal process, and we are confident in the legal case that the Department of Justice will be making.
Well, but if that was their intent, why didn't they write it into the law? They had the opportunity. They didn't. They specifically qualified the law based on the fact that it was going to be state exchanges. And I think it was because when they wrote the law, everybody assumed that all the states would open up an exchange. But they assumed wrong. And you remember, what they say about never assuming, because you make a you-know-what of you and me. And if you assume that something's going to happen and it doesn't happen, well, you can't go back and say, well, we really meant something else. No, right? You're right. If you assume that there's going to be a state exchange and you make the subsidy contingent on a person buying at a state exchange that you assume is going to be created, and then those exchanges aren't created, well, you can't go back and rewrite the law that was already passed unless you're going to pass a brand new law. That is the reality. It's a legislative process. The president is not a dictator who can rewrite the laws based on what he believes Congress intended, even if they passed something different. And I think it's all a big lie. I mean, here's one more clip from that conference. It's cut number 25.
The Department of Justice will litigate these claims through the federal court system. And again, our confidence is rooted in the fact that it is pretty obvious what the congressional intent was here. Their intent was for every eligible American who applied for tax credits to make their health care more affordable to have access to those tax credits, regardless of whether it was state officials or federal officials who were running the marketplace.
No, that is not obvious, because that's not what it says. It actually says that they have to do it through a state-run exchange. And I believe that the president assumed that all the states would open up an exchange, and he assumed wrong. And now he's backtracking and trying to rewrite the law and claiming that that's what he meant all along. It's not what he meant. I mean, who is he kidding? He believed that all the states would set up these exchanges. That's why it's worded the way it is. And they didn't set it up, and now he's rewriting the law after the fact and claiming, well, that's what I intended all along. It's one big lie, and hopefully the courts are not going to fall for it. Andy is calling in all the way from Tokyo, had a comment about the Obamacare subsidies. Andy, you're up.
Good evening, Peter, or good morning, whatever it is for you.
Yeah.
I think you're missing a little bit on the... It's morning. Sorry, I think you're missing a little bit on the decision by the circuit court. Obama's claiming that it wasn't intentional, but the language that was written in there was intentional. They wanted to punish the states. They thought they could put political pressure on them. So it's not that it wasn't intentional. It was intentionally put in there.
Well, yes, that's my point. They wrote it that way for a reason, and now they're pretending otherwise because the states didn't do what they thought they were going to do. They thought all the states would set up these exchanges. That's why it's worded this way. And you know what? It didn't work out the way the president planned, and tough. Do it, they shouldn't have they shouldn't have passed it as quickly as they did. But the reason they did that is because they were afraid if they deliberated more that it wouldn't get passed. Because as the details came out, people wouldn't like it. And so they jammed it through, and now they're trying to change it after the fact based on this ridiculous intent. Meanwhile, where original intent really matters when you're talking about the Constitution and the framers. They want nothing to do with original intent. They want to ignore the intent of the framers when they want the courts to rule on the constitutionality of all the unconstitutional stuff that they pass. David is calling up. He's in Kansas City. David, you're up.
Yeah, hi, Peter. Yeah,
Go ahead.
This is easily what the spokesman for the president said is easily proven to be a lie, because it doesn't make sense otherwise, and this is why. They set up exchanges in the law. The states were supposed to set these exchanges up. Some states set up exchanges, some states didn't. If they thought that it would be generally subsidized through the IRS and the federal government, why would they set up exchanges at all? In fact, why do the states who are paying through their own exchanges put up with paying through their own exchanges when there was a central authority authorized to pay the subsidies? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean that was part of the incentive for the states to set up an exchange, was that if you want your people to get a subsidy, you need to set up an exchange. But now that people can get a subsidy without an exchange, why would a state set one up if their citizens can be subsidized through a federal exchange? You're right. It undermines the whole process. The idea, the intent of this legislation was to have state exchanges. So, in fact, they're lying about what their intentions were.
Why would the governor of a state, of Massachusetts, for example, set up an exchange knowing that if he didn't, the subsidies would be provided by the other 49 states? This is bad economics. Now, I don't put that past the government. Obviously, they would do something that stupid, maybe for, brinksmanship or political showmanship, but it doesn't make any economic sense. If there is a basis in the law for the subsidies to be paid by the IRS through the central authority, then no need for an exchange would have existed.
Yeah, and they're talking about how obvious the intent was when they're lying. They're lying about everything. They intended the states to set up the exchanges. They intended the subsidies to be for the state-run exchanges, and the states didn't set up the exchanges, so they scrambled, and the president illegally rewrote the law because the law that was passed wasn't working, and now he's claiming that this is what we meant all along, and the court should just rubber stamp it. This is complete BS. The question is, will he get away with it? Hopefully not.